Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile. Cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye, something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in the silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theatre, he had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. In his character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance in the lives of down-going men. It is the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Mr. Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. The street, with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. 2 doors from one corner, however, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discoloured wall on the upper, and bore in every feature and marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. "Did you ever remark that door?" asked Mr. Enfield, and when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." "Indeed?" said Mr. Utterson with a slight change of voice. "And what was that?" "Well, it was this way," returned Mr. Enfield. "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, when all at once I saw 2 figures. One, a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other, a girl of maybe 8 or 10, who was running as hard as was able down a cross street. Well, the 2 ran into each other naturally enough at the corner, and then came the horrible part of the thing. For the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man. It was like some damned juggernaut. I gave a shout, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look, so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor for whom she had been sent put in his appearance. The doctor was the usual cut-and-dry apothecary, with a strong Edinburgh accent and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw him turn sick and white with desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine. And killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man that we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the time, as we were pitching it red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were as wild as harpies. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces. And there was the man in the middle, with a kind of black, sneering coolness. Frightened, too, I could see that, but carrying it off, sir, really, like Satan. "If you choose to make capital out of this accident," said he,
I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, says he. Name your figure.
Well, we screwed him out to £100 for the child's family. The next thing was to get the money. And where do you think he carried us but to that place with the door? Whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with the matter of £10 in gold and a cheque for the balance on Coots, drawn payable to bearer and signed with a name that I can't mention, although it is one of the points of my story, but it was a name at least very well known and often printed. Tut, tut, said Mr. Utterson. I see you feel as I do, said Mr. Enfield. Yes, it is a bad story. For my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with. A really damnable man. And the person that drew the cheque is on the very pink of the proprieties. The pair walked on again for a while, in silence. Mr. Utterson then asked rather suddenly, I want to ask the name of that man who walked over the child. Well, said Mr. Enfield, I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man of the name of Hyde. Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but never said a word more. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in sombre spirits and went into his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Henry Jekyll's will, and sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. The will was holograph, for Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. It provided not only that in case of the decease of Henry Jekyll, MD, DCL, LLD, FRS, etc., all his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde, but that in case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, that the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay. This document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. It offended him both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest. And hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. Now, by sudden turn, it was his knowledge. I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe. And now I begin to fear it is disgrace. A fortnight later, by excellent good fortune, Dr. Jekyll gave one of his pleasant dinners to some 5 or 6 old cronies, all intelligent, reputable men and all judges of good wine. And Mr. Utterson so contrived that he remained behind after the others had departed. Where Utterson was liked, he was liked well, and to this rule Dr. Jekyll was no exception. And as he now sat opposite sides of the fire, a large, well-made, smooth-faced man of 50 with something of a stylish cast, perhaps, but every mark of capacity and kindness, you could see by his looks that he cherished for Mr. Utterson a sincere and warm affection. I've been wanting to speak to you, Jekyll, began the latter. You know that will of yours? A close observer might have gathered that the topic was distasteful, but the doctor carried it off gaily. Oh, my poor Utterson, said he. You are unfortunate in such a client. I never saw a man so distressed as you were by my will. You know I never approved of it, pursued Utterson. My will, yes, certainly, I know that, said the doctor, a trifle sharply. You have told me so. Well, I'll tell you so again, continued the lawyer. I have been learning something of young Hyde. The large, handsome face of Dr. Jekyll grew pale to the very lips, and there came a blackness about his eyes. I do not care to hear more, said he. This is a matter I thought that we had agreed to drop. What I heard was abominable, said Utterson. Well, I can make no change. You do not understand my position, returned the doctor with a certain incoherency of manner. Utterson reflected a little, looking in the fire. I've no doubt that you are perfectly right, he said at last, getting to his feet. But since we have touched upon this business, and for the last time, I hope, continued the doctor, there is one point I should like you to understand. If I am taken away, Utterson, I wish you to promise me that you will bear with him and get his rights for him. I only ask you to help him for my sake, when I am no longer here. Utterson heaved an irrepressible sigh. Well, said he, I promise. Nearly a year later, London was startled by a crime of singular ferocity and rendered all the more notable by the high position of the victim. The details were few and startling. A maidservant, living alone in a house not far from the river, had gone upstairs to bed about 11. Although a fog rolled over the city in the small hours, the early part of the night was cloudless, and the lane, which the maid's window overlooked, was brilliantly lit by the full moon. It seems she was romantically given, for she sat down upon her box, which stood immediately under the window, and fell into a dream of musing. And as she so sat, she became aware of an aged, beautiful gentleman with white hair drawing near along the lane, and advancing to meet him, another and very small gentleman. Presently, her eye wandered to the other, and she was surprised to recognize in him a certain Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master and for whom she had conceived a dislike. He had in his hand a heavy cane with which he was trifling, but he answered never a word and seemed to listen with ill-contained impatience. And then, all of a sudden, he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying on like a madman. And next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. It was 2 o'clock when she came to herself and called for the police. The murderer was gone long ago, but there lay his victim, in the middle of the lane, incredibly mangled. The stick with which the deed had been done, although it was of some rare and very tough and heavy wood, had broken in the middle under the stress of this insensate cruelty, and one splintered half had rolled in the neighboring gutter. The other, without doubt, had been carried away by the murderer. A purse and gold watch were found upon the victim, but no cards or papers, except a sealed and stamped envelope, which he'd been probably carrying to the post, and which bore the name and address of Mr. Utterson. This was brought to the lawyer the next morning, and with this same grave countenance, he hurried through his breakfast and drove to the police station, whither the body had been carried. And as soon as he came into the cell, he nodded. Yes, he said. I recognize him. I am sorry to say that this is Sir Danvers Carew. Good God, sir, exclaimed the police officer. Is it possible? And the next moment his eyes lighted up with professional ambition. Oh, perhaps you can help us to the man. And he briefly narrated what the maid had seen and showed the broken stick. Mr. Utterson had already quailed at the name of Hyde, but when the stick was laid before him, he could doubt no longer. Broken and battered as it was, he recognized it for one that he had himself presented many years before to Henry Jekyll. It was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson found his way to Dr. Jekyll's door, where he was at once admitted by Poole, the butler, and carried down by the kitchen offices across a yard which had once been a garden to the building which was indifferently known as the laboratory or dissecting rooms. It was the first time that the lawyer had been received in that part of his friend's quarters, and he eyed the dingy windowless structure with curiosity and gazed around with a distasteful sense of strangeness as he crossed the theatre. At the further end, a flight of stairs mounted to a door covered with red baize, and through this, Mr. Utterson was at last received into the doctor's cabinet. A fire burned in the grate. A lamp was set lighted on the chimney shelf. And even in the houses, the fog began to lie thickly. And there, close to the warmth, sat Dr. Jekyll, looking deathly sick. He did not rise to meet his visitor, but held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. "And now," said Mr. Utterson, as soon as Poole had left them, "you've heard the news." The doctor shuddered. "They were crying it in the square," he said. "I heard them in my dining room." "One word," said the lawyer. "Carew was my client, but so are you, and I want to know what I'm doing. You've not been mad enough to hide this fellow." "Utterson, I swear to God," cried the doctor. "I swear to God, I will never set eyes on him again. And indeed, he doesn't want my help. You do not know him as I do. He's safe. He's quite safe. And mark my words, he will never more be heard of." The lawyer listened gloomily. He did not like his friend's feverish manner. "You seem pretty sure of him," said he. "And for your sake, I hope you may be right. If it came to trial, your name might appear." "I am quite sure of him," replied Jekyll. "I have grounds for certainty that I cannot share with anyone. But there is one thing on which you may advise me. I have received a letter, and I am at a loss whether I should show it to the police. I should like to leave it in your hands, Utterson. You would judge wisely, I am sure. I have so great a trust in you." "You fear, I suppose, it might lead to his detection?" asked the lawyer. "No, I cannot say that I care what becomes of Hyde. I'm quite done with him. I was thinking of my own character, which this hateful business has rather exposed." Utterson ruminated a while. He was surprised at his friend's selfishness, and yet he was relieved by it. "Well," he said at last, "let me see the letter." The letter was written in an odd, upright hand and signed Edward Hyde, and it signified, briefly enough, that the writer's benefactor, Dr. Jekyll, whom he had so long unworthily repaid for 1,000 generosities, need labour under no alarm for his safety, as he had means of escape on which he placed a sure dependence. "Have you the envelope?" asked the lawyer. "I burnt it," replied Jekyll, "before I thought what I was about. But it bore no postmark. The note was handed in." "Shall I keep this and sleep upon it?" asked Utterson. "I wish you to judge for me entirely," was the reply. "I have lost confidence in myself." On his way out, the lawyer stopped and had a word or two with Poole. "By the by," he said, "there was a letter handed in today. What was the messenger like?" But Poole was positive nothing had come except by post. "And only circulars by that," he added. This news sent off Utterson with renewed fears. Presently after, he sat on one side of his own hearth, with Mr. Guest, his head clerk, upon the other, and midway between, a bottle of a particular old wine that had long dwelt unsunned in the foundations of his house. There was no man from whom he kept fewer secrets than Mr. Guest. "This is a sad business about Sir Danvers," said Utterson. "Yes, sir, indeed. It has elicited a great deal of public feeling," returned Guest. "The man, of course, was mad." "I'd like to hear your views on that," replied Utterson. "I have here a document in his handwriting. It is between ourselves, for I scarce know what to do about it. It's an ugly business at the best. But there it is, quite in your way. A murderer's autograph." Guest's eyes brightened, and he sat down at once and he studied it with passion. "No, sir," he said, "not mad, but it is an odd hand." "And by all accounts, a very odd writer," said the lawyer. And then the servant entered with a note. "Is that from Dr. Jekyll, sir?" inquired the clerk. I thought I knew the writing. Anything private, Mr. Utterson?" "It's only an invitation to dinner. Why? You want to see it?" One moment. I thank you, sir." And the clerk laid the 2 sheets of paper alongside and sedulously compared their contents. There was a pause, during which Mr. Utterson struggled with himself. "Why do you compare them, Guest?" he inquired suddenly. "Oh, well, sir," returned the clerk, "there's a rather singular resemblance. The 2 hands are in many points identical, only differently sloped." "Rather quaint," said Utterson. "It is, sir, as you say, rather quaint," returned the Guest. "I wouldn't speak of this note, you know," said the master. "Oh, no, sir," said the clerk. I understand." But no sooner was Mr. Utterson alone that night that he locked the note into his safe, where it reposed from that time forward. "What?" he thought. "Henry Jekyll, a forge for a murderer?" And his blood ran cold in his veins. Time ran on. Thousands of pounds were offered in reward, for the death of Sir Danvers was resented as a public injury. But Mr. Hyde had disappeared out of the ken of the police as though he had never existed. Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner when he was surprised to receive a visit from Poole. "Bless me, Poole, what brings you here?" he cried. And then, taking a second look at him, "What ails you?" he added. "Is the doctor ill?" "You know the doctor's ways, sir," replied Poole, "and how he shuts himself up. Well, he's shut up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it. Mr. Utterson, sir, I'm afraid." The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was altered for the worse, and except for the moment when he had first announced his terror, he had not once looked the lawyer in the face. "Come," said the lawyer. "I see you have some good reason, Poole. I see there is something seriously amiss. Try to tell me what it is." "I daren't say, sir," was the answer. "But will you come along with me and see for yourself?" It was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March, with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her. The square, when they got there, was full of wind and dust. Poole led the way to the back garden.
"Now, sir," he said, "you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard."
Mr. Utterson recollected his courage and followed the butler into the laboratory building through the surgical theatre.
Here, Poole motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while he himself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call on his resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red baize of the cabinet door. "Mr. Utterson, sir, asking to see you," he called. A voice answered from within.
"Tell him I cannot see anyone,"
it said, complainingly. "Thank you, sir," said Poole, with a note of something like triumph in his voice, and taking up the candle, he led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the great kitchen. "Sir," he said, looking Mr. Utterson in the eyes, "was that my master's voice?"
"It seems much changed," replied the lawyer, very pale, but giving look for look.
"Changed? Well, yes, I think so," said the butler. "Master was made away with 8 days ago when we heard him cry upon the name of God. And who was in there instead of him, and why it stays there is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson."
"This is a very strange tale, Poole. This is a rather wild tale, my man," said Mr. Utterson, biting his finger. "Suppose it were as you suppose, supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, well, murdered. What could induce the murderer to stay?"
"Well, Mr. Utterson, you are a hard man to satisfy, but I'll do it yet," said Poole. "All this last week, him, or it, whatever it is that lives in that cabinet, has been crying day and night for some sort of medicine. It was sometimes his way, the master's that is, to write his orders on a sheet of paper and throw it on the stair. Well, sir, every day, and twice and thrice in the same day, there have been orders and complaints, and I've been sent flying to all the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought the stuff back, there'd be another paper telling me to return it because it was not pure, and another form to a different firm."
"Poole," replied the lawyer, "if you say that, it will become my duty to make certain. Much as I desire to spare your master's feelings, I shall consider it my duty to break in that door."
"Ah, Mr. Utterson, that's talking," cried Poole. "There is an axe in the theatre," he continued, "and you might take the kitchen poker for yourself."
Taking the poker under his arm, the lawyer led the way into the yard. The scud had banked over the moon, and now it was quite dark. The wind tossed the light of the candle to and fro about their steps until they came into the shelter of the theatre, where they sat down, silently to wait. London hummed solemnly all around, but nearer at hand, the stillness was only broken by the sounds of a footfall moving to and fro along the cabinet floor.
"So it will walk all day, sir," whispered Poole. "Aye, and the better part of the night. Only when a new sample comes from the chemist there's a bit of a break. Oh, it's an ill conscience that's such an enemy to rest. But hark again, a little closer. Put your heart in your ears, Mr. Utterson, and tell me, is that the doctor's foot?"
The steps fell lightly and oddly with a certain swing. For all they went so slowly, it was different indeed from the heavy, creaking tread of Henry Jekyll. Utterson sighed. "Is there never anything else?" he asked. Poole nodded.
"Once," he said. "Once I heard it weeping."
"Weeping? How was that?" said the lawyer, conscious of a sudden chill of horror.
"Weeping, like a woman or a lost soul," said the butler. "I came away with that upon my heart that I could have wept too."
Poole disinterred the axe from under a stack of packing straw. The candle was set upon the nearest table to light them to the attack, and they drew near with bated breath, where that patient foot was still going up and down, in the quiet of the night. "Jekyll!" cried Utterson with a loud voice. "I demand to see you!" He paused a moment, but then came no reply. "I give you fair warning.
Our suspicions are aroused, and I must, and I shall see you, he resumed. If not by fair means, then by foul. If not your consent, then by brute force.
Utterson,
Said the voice.
for God's sake, have mercy.
That's not Jekyll's voice. It's Hyde's, cried Utterson. Down with the door, Poole. Poole swung the axe over his shoulder. The blow shook the building, and the red baize door leapt against the lock and hinges. A dismal screech, as of mere animal terror, rang from the cabinet. Up went the axe again, and again the panels crashed and the frame bounded. 4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough, and the fittings were of excellent workmanship, and it was not until the 5th the lock burst, and the wreck of the door fell inward on the carpet. The besiegers, appalled by their own riot and the stillness that had succeeded, stood back a little and peered in. Right in the middle, there lay the body of a man, sorely contorted and still twitching. They drew near on tiptoe, turned it on its back, and beheld the face of Edward Hyde. He was dressed in clothes far too large for him, clothes of the doctor's bigness. The chords of his face still moved with a semblance of life, but life was quite gone. And by the crushed vial in the hand and the strong smell of kernels that hung upon the air, Utterson knew that he was looking on the body of a self-destroyer. "We have come too late," he said sternly. "Whether to save or punish. Hyde is gone to his account, and it only remains for us to find the body of your master." But nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Still with an occasional awestruck glance at the dead body, the searchers proceeded more thoroughly to examine the contents of the cabinet. At one table there were traces of chemical work, various measured heaps of some white salt being laid on glass saucers. On the business table, among the neat array of papers, a large envelope was uppermost, and bore in the doctor's hand the name of Mr. Utterson. The lawyer unsealed it, and 2 enclosures fell to the floor. The first was a will, drawn in the same eccentric terms as the one which he had returned 6 months before to serve as a testament in case of death and as a deed of gift in case of disappearance. But in place of the name of Edward Hyde, the lawyer, with indescribable amazement, read the name of Gabriel John Utterson. "My head goes round," he said. "He has been all these days in possession. He had no cause to like me. He must have raged to see himself displaced. And he has not destroyed this document." He caught up the next paper. It was a brief note in Dr. Jekyll's hand and dated at the top. "Oh, Poole," the lawyer cried. "He was alive and here this day. He cannot have been disposed of in so short a space. He must still be alive. He must have fled. And then why fled and how? And in that case, can we venture to declare this suicide?" "Why don't you read it, sir?" asked Poole. "Because I fear," replied the lawyer solemnly. And with that, he brought the paper to his eyes and read as follows. "My dear Utterson, when this shall fall into your hands, I shall have disappeared. Under what circumstances I have not the penetration to foresee, but my instinct and all the circumstances of my nameless situation tell me that the end is sure and must be early. Go then and read, if you care, the confession of your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll."
I was born to a large fortune, endowed besides with excellent parts, inclined by nature to industry, fond of the respect of the wise and good among my fellow men, and thus, as might have been supposed, with every guarantee of an honourable and distinguished future. And indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look around me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of me. With every day and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to that truth by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. It was on the moral side, and in my own person, that I learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, I was only because I was radically both. And from an early date, even before the course of my scientific discoveries had begun to suggest the most naked possibility of such a miracle, I had learned to dwell with pleasure, as a beloved daydream, on the thought of the separation of these elements. If each, I told myself, could be housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable. The unjust might go his way, delivered from the aspirations and remorse of his more upright twin, and the just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found his pleasure, no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of this extraneous evil. How, then, were they dissociated? I was so far in my reflections when, as I have said, a sidelight began to shine upon the subject from my laboratory table. I began to perceive more deeply than it has ever yet been stated the trembling immateriality, the mist-like transience of this seemingly so solid body that we walk attired. Certain agents I found to have the power to shake and pluck back that fleshy vestment, even as a wind might toss the curtains of a pavilion. I hesitated long before I put this theory to the test of practice. I knew well that I risked death, for any drug that so potently controlled and shook the very fortress of identity might, by the least scruple of an overdose or the least inopportunity in the moment of exhibition, utterly blot out that immaterial tabernacle which I looked to it to change. But the temptation of a discovery so singular and profound at last overcame the suggestions of alarm. I had long since prepared my tincture. I purchased at once from a firm of wholesale chemists a large quantity of a particular salt, which I knew from my experiments to be the last ingredient required. And late, one accursed night, I compounded the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in the glass, and when the ebullition had subsided, with a strong glow of courage, drank off the poison. The most racking pangs succeeded. A grinding in the bones, deadly nausea, and a horror of the spirit that cannot be exceeded at the hour of birth or death. And then these agonies began swiftly to subside. And I came to myself as if out of a great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered, sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil, and the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. I stretched out my hands, exulting in the freshness of these sensations, and in the act, I was suddenly aware that I had lost in stature. There was no cheval glass at that date in my room. That which stands beside me as I write was brought there later on, and for the very purposes of these transformations. I crossed the yard wherein the constellations looked down upon me. I stole through the corridors, a stranger in my own house, and coming to my room, I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. The evil side of my nature, to which I had now transferred the stamping efficacy, was less robust and less developed than the good which I had just imposed. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 a life of effort, virtue and control, it had been much less exercised, much less exhausted. And hence, as I think, it came about that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. And yet when I looked upon that ugly idol in the glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather than a leap of welcome. This too was myself. I lingered but a moment at the mirror. The second and conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted. It yet remained to be seen if I had lost my identity beyond redemption and must flee before daylight from a house that was no longer mine. And hurrying back to my cabinet, I once more prepared, drank the cup, once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character and the face of Henry Jekyll. That night, I had come to the fatal crossroads. Even at that time, I had not conquered my aversion to the dryness of a life of study. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and, as my pleasures were, to say the least, undignified. It was on this side that my new power tempted me until I fell in slavery. I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of the noted professor, and to assume, like a thick cloak, that of Edward Hyde. I smiled at the notion, seemed to me at the time to be humorous, and I made my preparations with the most studious care. I drew up that will, to which you so much objected, so that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll, I could enter on that of Edward Hyde without pecuniary loss. And thus, fortified, as I supposed, on every side, I began to profit by the strange immunities of my position. Men have before hired bravos to transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under shelter. I was the first that ever did so for his pleasures. I was the first that could plod in the public eye, with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spring headlong into a sea of liberty. But for me, in my impenetrable mantle, safety was complete. Think of it. I did not even exist. The pleasures which I made haste to seek in my disguise were, as I have said, undignified. I would scarce use a harder term. But in the hands of Edward Hyde, they soon began to turn toward the monstrous. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged into a kind of wonder at the vicarious depravity. This familiar that I called out of my own soul and sent forth alone to do his good pleasure was a being inherently malign and villainous. His every act and thought centered on self, drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another, relentless like a man of stone. Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde. But the situation was apart from ordinary laws, and insidiously relaxed the grasp of conscience. It was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone, that was guilty. I thought I sat beyond the reach of fate. Some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, I had been out for one of my adventures, had returned at a late hour, and woke the next day in bed with somewhat odd sensations. My eyes fell upon my hand. Now, the hand of Henry Jekyll was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white, and comely. But the hand which I now saw, clearly enough in the yellow light of a mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bedclothes, was lean, corder, knuckly, of a dusky pallor, and thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. I must have stared upon it for nearly half a minute, sunk as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my breast as sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals, and bounding from the bed I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll. I had awakened Edward Hyde. How was this to be explained? I asked myself, and then with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? It was well on in the morning. The servants were up. All my drugs were in the cabinet. A long journey down 2 pairs of stairs, through the back passage, across the open court, and through the anatomical theatre. I had soon dressed, as well as I was able, in clothes of my own size. had soon passed through the house, and 10 minutes later, Dr. Jekyll had returned to his own shape and was sitting down with a darkened brow to make a feint of breakfasting. Small indeed was my appetite. All things seemed to point to this, that I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. Between these two, I now felt I had to choose. To cast in my lot with Jekyll was to die those appetites which I had long secretly indulged and had of late begun to pamper. To cast it in with Hyde was to die 1,000 interests and aspirations and to become at a blow and forever despised, friendless. The bargain might appear unequal, but there was still another consideration in the scales. For while Jekyll would suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence, Hyde would not be even conscious of all that he had lost. Yes, I preferred the elderly and discontented doctor, surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hopes, and bade a resolute farewell to the liberty, the comparative youth, the light step, the leaping impulses and secret pleasures that I had enjoyed in the disguise of Hyde. For 2 months, I was true to my determination. For 2 months, I led a life of such severity as I had never before attained to, and enjoyed the compensations of an approving conscience. But time began at last to obliterate the freshness of my alarm. I began to be tortured with throes and longings, as of Hyde struggling after freedom. And at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I once again compounded and swallowed the transforming draught. My devil had been long caged, and he came out roaring. Instantly the spirit of hell awoke in me and raged. With a transport of glee, I mauled Carew's unresisting body, tasting delight from every blow, and it was not until weariness had begun to succeed that I was suddenly, in the top fit of my delirium, struck through the heart by a cold thrill of terror. A mist dispersed. I saw my life to be forfeit and fled from the scene of these excesses, at once glorying and trembling. My lust of evil gratified and stimulated my love of life, screwed to the topmost peg. The next day came the news that the murder had been witnessed, that the guilt of Hyde was patent to the world, and that the victim was a man high in public estimation. I think I was glad to know it. I think I was glad to have my better impulses thus buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now my city of refuge. But let Hyde peep out an instant, and the hands of all men would be raised to take and slay him. I resolved in my future conduct to redeem the past, and I can say with honesty that my resolve was fruitful of some good. You know yourself how earnestly in the last months of the last year I labored to relieve suffering. You know that much was done for others, and that the days passed quietly, almost happily for myself. There comes an end to all things. It was a fine, clear January day, wet underfoot, where the frost had melted, but cloudless overhead. And the Regent's Park was full of winter chirrupings and sweet with spring odours. I sat in the sun on a bench, the animal within me licking the chops of memory. The spiritual side a little drowsed, promising subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin. After all, I reflected, I was like my neighbours. And then I smiled, comparing myself with other men, comparing my goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at that very moment of that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a horrid nausea, and the most deadly shuddering. These passed away and left me faint, and then, as in its turn faintness subsided, I began to be aware of a change in the temper of my thoughts, a greater boldness, a contempt of danger, a solution of the bonds of obligation. I looked down. My clothes hung formlessly on my limbs. The hand that lay on my knee was corded and hairy. I was once more Edward Hyde. A moment before, I had been safe of all men's respect, wealthy, beloved. And now I was the common quarry of mankind, hunted, houseless, a known murderer, thrall to the gallows. My drugs were in one of the presses of my cabinet. How was I to reach them? That was the problem, crushing my temples in my hands, and I set myself to solve. A change had come over me. It was no longer the fear of the gallows, it was the horror of being Hyde that racked me. In a dream that I came home to my own house and got into bed. I slept after the prostration of the day with a stringent and profound slumber which not even the nightmares that wrung me could avail to break. I awoke in the morning, shaken, weakened, but refreshed. I was stepping leisurely across the court after breakfast, drinking the chill of the air with pleasure, when I was seized again with those indescribable sensations that heralded the change. And I had but the time to gain the shelter of my cabinet before I was once again raging and freezing with the passions of Hyde. It took, on this occasion, a double dose to recall me to myself. And alas, 6 hours after, as I sat looking sadly in the fire, the pangs returned and the drug had to be re-administered. In short, from that day forth, it seemed only by a great effort as of gymnastics, and only under the immediate stimulation of the drug, that I was able to wear the countenance of Jekyll. At all hours of the day and night, I would be taken with a premonitory shudder. Above all, if I slept or even dozed for a moment in my chair, it was always as Hyde that I awakened. My provision of the salt, which had never been renewed since the date of the first experiment, began to run low. I sent out for a fresh supply and mixed the draught. I drank it, and it was without efficiency. You will learn from Poole how I have had London ransacked. It was in vain, and I am now persuaded that my first supply was impure, and that it was that unknown impurity which lent efficacy to the draught. About a week has passed, and I am now finishing this statement under the influence of the last of the old powders. This, then, is the last time. Short of a miracle, that Henry Jekyll can think his own thoughts or see his own face in the glass. And indeed, the doom that is closing on us both has already changed and crushed Hyde. Half an hour from now, when I shall again and forever re-endue that hated personality, I know how I shall sit, shuddering and weeping in my chair, or continue with the most strained and fear-struck ecstasy of listening, to pace up and down this room and give ear to every sound of menace. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold? Or will he find courage to release himself at the last moment? God knows. I am careless. And this is the true hour of my death. And what is to follow concerns. Here then, as I lay down the pen and proceed to seal up my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end.
Down with the door, Poole.